classify this, I would do this journey to free thought. So this, I guess, is my origin story for those of you that are X-Men fans. Over the last few weeks, we've heard some really interesting tales of people's origin stories. Jim, for example, and Roman, and how they've come into or been born into free thought. So this is kind of my story. So those of you who know, I am a scientist. I have a PhD in microbiology and molecular genetics. So this is also kind of a story of my my career a little bit that will help you understand my process. And it is possible to be a scientist and have religious thoughts. So that's another point I want to make. It seems that those two things would not be, you would think those two things would be kind of counterintuitive, but in fact that they're not for some of us. So anyway, I guess I will just, I have a little cheat sheet here because there are some points I want to cover. So this is a story of me and how I've come to be here, and how I've used the scientific method, just as I would in the lab to solve scientific problems, how I would use the scientific method to come to free thought. So let me just back up and I'll just tell you a little bit about myself. So I was born into a family that was Catholic, but kind of loosey-goosey, like we went to church. My mom wanted me to get First Communion so she could see me in the dress. There's no other reason but that. We went to church occasionally, but it was kind of like, hey, we'll go to church, we believe in God, but it wasn't, it wasn't preachy. It was like, oh, this is just something we do. This is what everybody else does. In high school, so I had a single mom, and all the struggles that come along with having a single mom. Like we were going through periods of being very poor and just not having any money, and eventually we kind of got on our feet. I got into high school, and I had a boyfriend who went to a Protestant church. And to be honest, I didn't really like the Catholic church. It was very, preachy and kind of scary. And I actually do remember some sermons being done in Latin. So I think that was a common thing like back in the day. So I started going to the Protestant church, and I thought, wow, this is exactly what I'm looking for. They're very friendly and open, and they're all about the community. And the pastor was married, and he had a family, and at the end he'd come up and he'd talk to everybody, and he was just such a nice guy, like a nice person you'd actually want to hang out with. So at that point I realized I wasn't Catholic anymore, I was actually Protestant. So I went home, I told my family, I'm Protestant now, and they're like, okay, well you're doing something, we don't care what you do, it's fine. And my boyfriend, so I was in high school, my boyfriend's father at that time, he had a degree in theology, and they were just a really good, solid family. His parents were married, they had this amazing marriage, just the kind of marriage that you want to have someday. So I'd look at them like, that's the marriage I want to have someday. So that's a little side note. So I became Protestant at that point. Then I went into college. I studied, obviously I knew from a very young age I wanted to be in science. So I took my first biology course at Framingham State. One of my first days there, the professor said to us, for those of you who have any religious beliefs, this is probably your first step to having none. Because as you go on in biology, you're going to start questioning your religious beliefs. So I didn't think much of it at the time because I believed in God, and I'm like, well, I'm not one of those, intensely Catholic people. I believe in God, but I'm not, I didn't think much of it at the time, and I just kind of went along. So during my college years, I made some friends, as we all do, that you have for your lifetime. So there's something about the college experience, right? You make friends, and you keep them forever. So I made two friends, my friend Pam, who was I wouldn't say a staunch Catholic, but pretty religious. She would follow all the holidays, did Lent, went to church every day, went to church when she was at school. So she had a very elaborate Catholic wedding later on. And then my other friend Melanie was a somewhat practicing Jew. So it was kind of the three of us. We were very close friends, and we did everything together, shopping and dinners and movies, whatever. And so the three of us, we went on to live together after school. So we got an apartment, and the three of us lived together for a few years after school. This is the part of the story that gets hard. So I went on to grad school at UMass, and I continued being a part of the Protestant church. So there was a church out in Worcester, in Millbury, that was a congregational Catholic Protestant church, and I loved going there. And the pastor was a woman, and she told me, that in her spare time, she conducted same-sex marriages, which to me was really important because my brother had just come out. He was a lot younger than me. He was about 16 at the time. And so it was very important to me to be related to a church, but one that was forward-thinking, one that was liberal, but it put a huge emphasis on community. So there was actually a homeless shelter, or a women's shelter across the street for women, and we did a lot of work with them, dinners and just lots of work with them. I hosted the Christmas pageant for like 2 years, and just I was very, very, very heavily involved in the Protestant church because of their continued desire to help the community, because that was really what was important to me. I mean, the sermons were, we talked about God, but it wasn't overly preachy. It was just, we're here to help each other, we're here to be a community, and to be a good person, you need to contribute to the community. So that was graduate school. So fast forward, anybody that knows, a PhD in science takes about six, 7 years. So early 2008, I finally graduated after about 6.5 years with my PhD. And again, Pam and Melanie and I continued our dinners and movies and just kind of hanging out together and kind of going along through life. They got married a little bit before I did. They had kids. So at that point, Pam had 2 kids. She had a son and a daughter. They were about 1 and 6. And Melanie had us about middle of 2008. This is just to kind of give you the timeline. She had a son, Tyler, who was about 1. So I got my PhD. I'm living with Roman in Watertown. And so Pam and I were very close, and we went out a lot, and she was very open to going out. Melanie was a little different. She kind of was a homebody. She'd like to stay home, and it took some effort to get her out of the house. You have to call her like a couple times. Oh, come on out with us. We're going to go out to dinner. Come on. Oh, I kind of want to stay home. So mid-2008, I started calling her, and she wasn't returning my phone calls. And I didn't think much about it at the time, because I thought, this is someone that, she kind of likes being home. She's very invested in her job, and now she has a kid. So I didn't think much about it at the time. I just want to back up one thing I forgot to mention. I saw her at her house when she first had her baby. I went to visit her at the house, and she's a short girl, so she's about 4'8" or so. So she's pretty short, and I see her sitting on the floor with this ginormous, like mountainous of baby. I mean, you can never imagine that a thing this huge could come out of such a small person. And she's just sitting on the floor with him, just playing with him, and the happiest I'd ever seen her, because she wasn't one that, would want to go out very much. So it was nice to see her kind of in her element. And later I would call her, and you could hear the baby just, if you have kids, you know what I'm talking about, they're like screaming like banshees in the background, and she's just very calmly like, how are you doing? Yeah, we're going to have dinner this weekend? Okay. So she seemed so much in her element with her son, and it was just amazing to see. And of course, now that I have kids, I can kind of reflect on that, what that means. So mid-2008, I called her a few times. I didn't get any response, and didn't really worry, but I was like, oh, this is really strange. She's not calling me back. So finally, her husband ends up calling me and saying that she was in the hospital. Nothing serious. She'd been diagnosed with Crohn's disease probably the year or 2 before, and anybody knows what Crohn's disease is. It's a very common auto-inflammatory kind of disease of the gut, and she was having flare-ups, and they decided to treat her with immunosuppressants. So a lot of inflammatory disease, they use immunosuppressants to kind of quiet the immune system, and that seemed to be really helping her flare-ups. Well, the downside to that, I'm sorry if I'm going too long, the downside to that is you can be prone to infections that you wouldn't normally get if you were healthy and not on immunosuppressants. So she ended up getting what's called the CMV infection, which infected her lungs. So she was in the hospital being treated. So he called me to tell me she's fine, she's doing okay, she's in the hospital. But she doesn't want anyone to see her, because she's like in the hospital, and you can imagine you're kind of laying down, and you don't really want to be seeing people when you're in that kind of situation. So I didn't think much of it, and I'm like, okay, I'll just wait till she gets out of the hospital, and then I will, I'll see how she's doing. So a few weeks goes by, and he calls me another time, and he says, well, she's taken a turn for the worse, and the infection in her lungs has gotten so bad they've decided to induce a coma, because the thought is that the coma will help speed along her recovery. So this is I wouldn't say it's very common, but it's something that is done. to help the body recuperate. So at this point, she's 31 or 32. Her son is a year old. So he said, she's taken a turn for the worse. I think you and Pam should come and see her. And maybe that might help, speed her recovery. So I immediately called Pam. And within a few days, not the same day, but within a few days, we went to see her at the hospital. So I should just say about Pam, she's incredibly, she's like one of my best friends, and she's an incredibly good person. But I have never known her to cry. In 20 years, I have never known her to cry, except for this one instance. So we get to the hospital, and before we're going to go in, we're at MGH. Before we go in, Jeremy, her husband, says, I really need to talk to you first. So he ushers us into a room, and he sits us down. He's obviously upset, obviously crying. And he says to us, they were cleaning her breathing tube yesterday, and they forgot to put it back in. And they did a CAT scan and some tests and realized that she is now brain dead, and we've decided as a family to turn the machines off. So I've invited everyone. So when he called me that first time, he didn't know obviously this had happened. This had happened the night before. So instead of going to see her thinking she would get better and her lungs are healing, now we're seeing her for what we realize in that little room with her husband is the last time. So we enter the room at the hospital, and her husband's there, her mother, her father had passed away some years before, and her brother. And I will never forget that time in that room because it was so incredibly quiet. It was like if I was home back in the country in, Bumpkin, West Bridgewater in the middle of the night, and you go outside and you can't hear anything. And it was so incredibly quiet, and the only thing you could hear was the machines helping her breathe. So we stood there for an incredibly long time, just holding her hand, and Pam was stroking her hair. And Pam cried for the first time ever, I think, in 20 years. I have never seen her cry before or since. And of course I'm crying like a baby. And it was just a moment in my life I will never forget, because here was this person who was healthy, who had, she wasn't really that sick. I mean, Crohn's disease is a very manageable disease. And this was the last time we were going to see her, and it just kept washing over me. This is the last time. And she was obviously asleep, and she had all the breathing tubes, and she looked like someone who'd been in a coma for 2 weeks. So we just kind of stood there, and it was just so dumbfounding that this was it. This was, one of my best friends, the person I shop with, the person I have dinner with, the person we go to movies. She's so young. She's 32. Her birthday was like the next week, and her son is only a year old. It's like I just couldn't comprehend that. Just like couldn't, it just didn't register. So eventually we finally left the room, which was, I didn't want to leave, to be honest. I just stood there and I'm like, I don't want to leave because I know this is it. This is the last time I'm ever going to see her. But we finally left after a very long time. It was very hard to leave. I just remember standing there like, I just don't want to leave. But it was incredibly hard. So unfortunately for me, I didn't, Roman, we were together at the time and we were living in Watertown. And he didn't know when he left on his business trip that all this was going to happen. He knew Melanie was in the hospital, but he didn't know, that all this was going to happen. So I had to go home to an empty house, knowing that I had just seen my best friend for probably, well, definitely the last time. And I've experienced loss, grandparents, older people, but never someone that I knew so well and so close and so young, with this whole awesome life ahead of her. I mean, she just had a son, she had an awesome job, this awesome husband, and she could have had this whole amazing life because of a stupid mistake, really. I mean, a mistake. Someone forgot to put her breathing tube back in. Now, all that's been taken away, and it just didn't, I couldn't seem to, grasp that. I just couldn't wrap my head around that. So, of course, I called Roman first, and, being Roman, he doesn't really know how to deal with crying women. And, he's in New Jersey, so I didn't really know what to do. So my next phone call was to my grandmother, who had just lost the love of her life a few months before. And of course, being older, just knowing all the right things to say and calming me down and making me feel like everything was going to be okay, and that But she never said, you know, God has a plan. I mean, she was Catholic, but she never said God has a plan. She never said, you know, there's a reason for this. You know, she just said, you know, these things happen, and, you know, it's so hard, and it's hard to understand, but we just have to move on and be thankful. So that was a really defining moment for me. And it didn't happen right away, but I started kind of questioning the whole idea of God and this, you know, idea of an afterlife, and not questioning because how could this happen to someone so amazing and so beautiful who had this whole life ahead of her, but like, do I believe that there's something else because it makes me feel better, or because there really is a something else? Do I believe that Melanie is up there watching over her son because that's really what's happening, or it's because it makes me feel better? And I kind of have, over time, it didn't happen right away, but I've started to kind of question my beliefs because, you know, as a scientist and rationally, I can't, I guess I know what happens to the body when we die. I mean, I'm more than probably anybody going to know what happens, and I've kind of come to terms with the idea that she's probably not in some heaven that's beautiful and amazing, watching over her family, and she's not, she's gone. I mean, who I know as Melanie is gone, and that's a really hard kind of idea to get wrapped around my head. So the point of this is really not to make me cry, but having an event in my life that really defined and helped me kind of lead me to this idea of free thought, and that made me question my beliefs. And also, if I have got to learn anything from this, it's that later, much later, so that happened in 2008, I would have my own children. So a little over 2 years later, I'd have my own children, and really come to appreciate them in a way that I don't want to say that no one else could, but in a way that is very unique. Because now when I look at them, I think about Melanie all the time, because these are times I have with my kids that she'll never have. And every time I look at them, I'm like, I'm so lucky, and I probably appreciate them more than most people appreciate their kids, because I think about her all the time and all the time that she's lost, not with her kids, or her kid. So I think that's a real gift, and that's kind of the second thing I've gotten out of this whole experience, is not just the free thought, but the ability to look at my children and my husband with such thankfulness and gratitude, because I am so lucky and I have all this time. And every year that goes by, so next month will be I guess the 7-year anniversary of her death. Every year that goes by, I think, I am so lucky. And if I could give that to anybody, having that gratitude of being lucky and feeling like you are so lucky to have what you have, I mean, that's has really guided me in the last few years, especially as I've kind of come to this idea of she's gone and she's not coming back, and she's, you know, the whole idea of reincarnation is going to happen, and it's giving me a better way to live my life, really. I just appreciate what I have so much more now than I probably ever would have before. So that's my origin story. Thank you for listening. Yeah, that's it.